about viruses is that whenever they actually enter the body and they actually infect the host cell, a lot of times what happens is that a virus is going to become dormant. It's not going to be actively dividing. An example of this is, HIV. Um, Specifically, we call that the lysogenic cycle. So it touches the host cell and it's going to inject the DNA. What's going to happen is that the DNA is going to get incorporated into the host cell. So every time the host cell divides, the virus DNA is also going to divide as well. And one important thing is that certain environmental factors, such as, for example, ultraviolet radiation, can actually induce the propagation of the virus. And essentially, what happens is that eventually the virus is going to be released. And a lot of times, what happens is that that kills the host cell. Prions or prions is actually very interesting because they are proteins that they don't have the proper shape, so they're misfolded proteins, and they are actually act just like viruses. And so what happens with these prions is that these proteins actually induce normal proteins, so where they don't have the proper shape. And what happens here is that it causes degenerative diseases of the nervous system, such as, for example, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD, in humans, the actual cause scabies in sheep, in bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle, also known as mad cow disease. And literally, what's happening here is that you're creating holes in the brain. Infectious disease is classified as an epidemic if there are more cases than expected in a certain area for a certain period of time. An outbreak is an epidemic confined to a local area. For example, in 2013-2014, we actually had the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And in global epidemics or co-pandemics, and we're all familiar with one because we just went through it, for example, COVID-19. However, there's also other pandemics such as tuberculosis, malaria, influenza as well. This is a typical structure of HIV. What you can see here is that you have the caspid, and it has the caspid. You actually have, in this particular case, RNA. You also have the envelope, and on the surface of the envelope, you actually have different spike proteins. Now, HIV is very interested in the following manner. So the flow of information usually goes from DNA to mRNA into a protein. What this allows our bodies to have different mechanisms in case there is a mutation, it actually catches it. In the case of HIV, it actually has the opposite. It goes from mRNA to DNA. And since we don't have the mechanism to catch those mutations, a lot of times what happens is that if there's a mutation, it actually gets incorporated into the genome of HIV. And so what happens is that HIV is actually evolving quite fast, and this is why it's so difficult to actually treat it. Tuberculosis, or TB, is actually caused by bacteria. So the way that it spreads is that whenever an infected person sneezes or coughs, those droplets are actually floating in the air, and they can be infectious up to like hours. So the incubation period is 4 to 12 weeks. It develops very slowly. Now the good news is that we actually have cells, so such as, for example, macrophages or other white blood cells. What it does, they rush, or you have a cell that has been infected with TB, this bacteria, and what they do is they try to basically get rid of it. Now what happens is that you have the development of hard nodules in the lungs. Here we have an image of TB, or the tuberculosis bacteria. So what you can see here, that is in the rod shape. So it's bacillus. Again, so the way this bacteria is spread is like whenever an infected person coughs or sneezes, you have these droplets that are floating in the air, and they can be infectious for hours. So here we have an image of an infected lung. So what you can see here is the bacteria with the nodules that are formed. So whenever those macrophages, those white blood cells actually rush to get rid of those bacteria, then you actually have the formation of those nodules. In a person with the active form of tuberculosis, what happens is that the tuberculosis liquefies and forms a cavity, and then from then the bacteria can actually spread to other parts of the body. This disease can be fatal. Some of the symptoms of tuberculosis include bad cough, chest pain, and coughing up blood. And as the disease progresses, some of the symptoms include fatigue, loss of appetite, chills, fevers, and night sweats. And as the patient begins to lose weight and waste away. So this is, it's not a fun disease. So Therefore, it is important for all of us to protect ourselves. Now, there are some treatments for tuberculosis. Now, one of the problems is that there's actually a lot of resistant strains of TB. And so what happens is that multiple drugs are given between 12 to 24 months. So there are several drug-resistant forms of tuberculosis. For example, multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis and extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis. It takes about 6 months to kill all the tuberculosis bacteria in the body. So this is why it's extremely important to actually take the medication as a doctor prescribes. You cannot, just take it, for a couple months and be like, oh, I'm okay. No, like you have to take him, otherwise then the bacteria is going to become resistant, and pretty much there's nothing they can do at that point. So malaria is another disease that affects humans. And what's very interesting about malaria is it actually gets spread by a mosquito. So a mosquito serves as the vector, and so a vector is a living organism, usually an insect or an animal, that transfers the pathogen from one host to another. So in this particular case, the parasite that causes malaria belongs to the genus Plasmodium, which is a protist, and there are 4 species that infect humans. So one of the possible treatments for malaria is that they're suggesting the introduction of genetically modified mosquitoes, so that way they won't be able to spread